War is an algorithm. We will show its price. A child born in Syria in 2011 is now 14 years old. In that time, over 7,000 schools have been damaged or destroyed. Half the country's educational infrastructure no longer functions. That child may have attended school for a total of 2 or 3 years, or none at all. This is not a humanitarian statistic. It is an economic calculation, and the numbers are staggering. Education is the single largest long-term investment a nation makes in its own future GDP. When war destroys that investment, it does not just destroy buildings. It destroys the capacity of an entire economy to regenerate itself for decades to come. The cost is not paid today. It is paid every year for the rest of those children's lives, in wages that will never be earned, in productivity that will never exist, in tax revenue that will never be collected. We are going to calculate exactly what that costs. The baseline: what was lost. Before 2011, Syria was a middle-income country with steadily improving economic indicators. Government expenditure on education averaged 19.55% of the budget between 2006 and 2009. Primary school enrollment was near 100%. Literacy rates exceeded 90% for both men and women. The country was, by regional standards, an education success story. They said education systems recover after conflict, schools reopen, children return. They got over 7,000 schools damaged or destroyed, nearly half of all children between the ages of 6 and 15 out of school. A pre-war middle class comprising 60% of the population reduced to 10 to 15% today, and an $800 billion cumulative GDP loss, according to the UNDP's February 2025 report, a figure that reflects the near-total collapse of Syria's economy over 14 years of conflict. Education did not cause that collapse, but the destruction of education guarantees that the collapse will persist long after the fighting stops. The Syria calculation. Save the Children produced a precise economic estimate. If 2.8 million Syrian children never return to school, which, for millions of them, is now the most likely outcome, the long-term impact on Syria's post-war economy will be up to 5.4% of GDP every single year. That number needs context. Syria's pre-war GDP was approximately $60 billion. 5.4% of that is $3.2 billion annually, in perpetuity. Not a one-time cost. A recurring annual drag on the economy, year after year, for decades. It is the economic equivalent of a permanent tax imposed on the nation's future by the act of not educating its children. The direct cost of replacing destroyed schools and equipment has been estimated at $3 billion. That figure is almost irrelevant compared to the long-term productivity loss. You could rebuild every single school in Syria tomorrow. It would not restore the years of learning that were never delivered. The human capital, the knowledge, the skills, the cognitive development, those are gone. Permanently. Sudan, the world's largest education crisis. Syria established the template. Sudan is now executing it at an even larger scale. The armed conflict that erupted in April 2023 has disrupted the education of 19 million school-age children, the largest education crisis in the world today, according to UNICEF. Over 90% of Sudan's nearly 23,000 schools are closed or inaccessible. At least 10,400 schools have been shuttered in conflict-affected areas. Violent attacks on schools increased fourfold in the first year of fighting. Before the conflict began, 7 million Sudanese children were already out of school. The war added 12 million more to that number in months. UNICEF has calculated the economic consequence directly. The lifetime earning loss for this war-impacted generation of children, if the education disruption is not reversed, will amount to $26 billion. $26 billion. That is the price tag of one generation's lost education in Sudan, a country whose GDP stands at roughly $50 billion in normal years. The education crisis alone threatens to erase more than half a year's worth of the country's entire economic output, distributed across the lifetimes of millions of individuals. And the crisis is deepening. Teachers across Sudan have not been paid for over a year. Education spending has historically accounted for only 1 to 2% of Sudan's national budget. With 70% of families now living in poverty, sending children to school has become an economic impossibility for most households. The system is not just damaged, it has collapsed. The compounding mechanism. Education losses do not function like infrastructure damage. A destroyed bridge can be rebuilt in months. A destroyed school can be rebuilt in weeks. But the education that was not delivered during those weeks and months, and the years before and after, cannot be retroactively provided. The loss is irreversible in a way that physical destruction is not. The mechanism works like this. Children miss school during the conflict. When fighting stops, if it stops, those children are older. Many are no longer school age. Many have been displaced across international borders, where enrollment is expensive, documentation is unavailable, and language barriers exist. Girls are particularly affected. In conflict settings, the World Bank estimates that girls are 2.5 times more likely to remain out of school than boys, and far less likely to return once peace arrives. Child labor absorbs the gap. So does child marriage. In Sudan, 40% of displaced girls are expected to never return to formal education. These are not individual tragedies. They are economic outcomes. Each girl who does not complete her education represents a lifetime of reduced earnings, reduced productivity, and reduced contribution to national GDP. The cycle locks in. Less education means less economic growth. Less economic growth means less revenue to fund education. Less funding means fewer teachers, fewer schools, and fewer children educated. The system becomes self-perpetuating, a poverty trap with education at the center. The teacher problem. Infrastructure can be rebuilt with money and time. Teachers cannot be replaced on the same timeline. In Syria, the teaching workforce has been devastated. Teachers have been killed, displaced, or driven into other professions by years of unpaid salaries. The same pattern is repeating in Sudan, where teachers have not received pay for over a year. Training a qualified teacher takes 3 to 5 years. Retaining them in a post-conflict environment, where salaries are low, infrastructure is destroyed, and trauma is widespread, takes even longer. This means that even if schools are physically rebuilt, the human capacity to deliver education may not exist for years afterward. The reconstruction of an education system is not an infrastructure project. It is a generational project. It requires not just buildings and books, but trained professionals, functioning curricula, functioning economies capable of paying salaries, and time. Measured not in months, but in decades. The aid paradox. Nearly $1 billion has been spent on education programming in Syria over the past decade. The result? Fragmented, unstandardized, inconsistent delivery. Few materials have been harmonized across programs. Measurement of learning outcomes remains a critical weakness. Donors cannot verify what their money achieved. They said, international education aid will prevent a lost generation. They got a lost generation anyway, because the aid was insufficient in scale, inconsistent in delivery, and unable to address the root economic conditions that keep children out of school. Poverty, displacement, and insecurity cannot be solved by education programs alone. But without education, none of those problems can ever be solved either. The long view. The economic cost of education destruction is not visible in the year it happens. It does not appear in GDP figures for 2024 or 2025. It will appear in 2035, in 2040, in 2050, when an entire generation enters the workforce without the skills, credentials, or cognitive development needed to participate in a modern economy. Syria's $800 billion in cumulative GDP losses reflect 15 years of compounding damage. Education is one of the largest components of that compounding. Sudan's $26 billion lifetime earning loss for the current generation is a number that will materialize slowly, invisibly, across decades, long after the international community has moved on to the next crisis. This is the true cost structure of education destruction in war. It is deferred, it is invisible, and it is, in most cases, irreversible. Every school that burns is a tax on the future, not paid once, paid forever. Subscribe to What War Costs. The numbers that war leaves behind are the ones that matter most.